you.
Okay, so this is the sort of the more practical digital side of things. So I understand that a lot of people here are working in organizations that produce digital products and services. So I'm just going to go through some key things to think about. Obviously, I can't go through everything today, but just to kind of whet your appetite as to what the impact of digital is and some of the key actions that you can take to address it. If we go to the next slide. So the first thing to sort of do is just put on your radars that internet emissions are huge. A lot of people don't really know anything about the carbon footprint of the internet and digital services. And part of the reason for that is that it's not really talked about openly, and it's invisible. It all happens behind the scenes. You don't have exhaust pipes on your laptops, and you don't really see data centers, for example. They're anonymous warehouses on industrial estates that you'd never even know were there, and they don't have big chimneys or anything coming out of the top. But the internet carbon footprint is roughly equivalent to Germany, which is currently, I think, the 7th most polluting country in the world. So it's a huge impact. And in terms of total emissions, it's also roughly equivalent to the global aviation industry pre-pandemic. So currently it'll actually, with the pandemic, it will have overtaken aviation, as aviation's obviously reduced and internet usage has increased rapidly over the past 12 months. So we often think about the aviation industry as being this sort of, like bad boy of climate change. But actually, lots of industries have a surprisingly big impact, and the digital sector is one of those that is very much kind of flying under the radar. If we go to the next slide. So this is just for websites, but websitecarbon.com is a tool that we developed a few years back that you can use for free, just to kind of get a rough idea of the impact of different web pages. But an average website produces about 1.7 grams of CO2 per page view, and that's factoring in various different criteria of what happens when somebody visits a page and repeat page views and so on. But that's a small amount, but it scales up. A lot of websites have thousands, tens of thousands, even millions of page views per month. So once you start scaling these things up, you can actually result with quite big amounts of CO2. And so scale is really the name of the game. And it's really, things that sound small can have a surprisingly big impact. If we go to the next slide, this impact essentially comes from 3 places. And this is true for any type of digital services, not just websites. It's the data centers, which is where the information is stored and processed. It's the transmission networks that send the data around the world from the data center to the end user and back again. And the data can be traveling anything from tens of miles to thousands of miles for each interaction. And then the end user devices, which obviously the phones, computers, are all using electricity. The 4th thing, which is not on this slide, is the embodied energy of actually manufacturing and maintaining all of this infrastructure, which is actually also in itself huge. And we're constantly replacing equipment. For example, data center servers get replaced about every 3 years. And there's millions of servers being used in operation at any one time. But the good news is that essentially it all runs on electricity. So unlike the aviation industry, where they've got this huge problem of like, how do we decarbonize flight when the only way of really running commercial airlines is by burning jet fuel, the internet runs on electricity. So it can be run entirely on renewables. And that's really kind of the great opportunity that we have as an industry. So if we move to the next slide, I'm going to go through some top tips for embedding sustainable principles into digital projects. So the first one is streamlining user journeys. And this is something that I think is just good design anyway. It's good user experience and there's no downside to it. But basically, the longer people have to take to find something, the more pages they have to visit to do it, the more energy is going to be consumed. So optimizing user journeys is not just good for, it's not just good for profits and user experience, it's also good for the environment. I've got a picture of Finisterre here. They've got a nice example on their website of how they've reduced user journeys with their shopping basket. A lot of e-commerce sites have a what I call like a yo-yo user journey, where you want to buy a few different things from the same shop. You put a couple of things in your basket. You can't remember what you put in the basket, so you go to the cart page, have a look, and you come back to the shop, browse around. You've forgotten what's in your basket again. You keep going to the cart and back and cart and back. On Finisterre website, they have this little pull out on the side, and you can just see it at any time. That's what's in my basket. I never need to go to the cart page, and when I'm ready, I just click checkout. So it's really, really good user experience, and it's also very efficient. We move on to the next one. Images and making images efficient. So images are like on most websites, in the absence of video, they're the single biggest thing in terms of like file size and data that has to be transferred. So designing things so that they need less images, so using color and shape and texture instead of photographs can be really good way of improving efficiency. Using vector graphics, which designers would be familiar with, but using them on the internet means that you can make big shapes with very, very tiny files because you don't have to store all of the pixel data that you'd have in a photograph. And then designing the smallest version of your photos. And if we go on to the next slide, I'll show you some examples of what I mean by this. So, you know, a lot of websites, you land on the website, the first thing you see is like a full screen background image. It fills the whole screen. And it can be great, can be like, you know, create a good emotional connection with you the first time you land. But it also has a huge file size. So this image filling the screen, 1.2 megabytes as a JPEG. If we move on to the next one, we can see that if we halve the dimensions, we actually reduce the size to 360 kilobytes, 70% smaller. And if you design this well with kind of shape and color around it, you could actually have a similarly good impact, but reduce the file size by 70%. But the one on the right is interesting because the edge of the image is blurred. It's the same photo, the edge of the image is blurred. And it's then 47% smaller again. And the reason is that detail in photographs is what contributes to file size. It's basically just more information. So the simpler the images, the smaller the files. So as designers, thinking about how we can use shallow depth of field or cut out images and put them on like solid color backgrounds and things is a really nice way of making things beautiful, but also really, really efficient. And if we move on to the next one, black and white, again, we can reduce the file size even further because color detail is just another type of information that has to be stored in the file. So if you can use black and white imagery as an aesthetic, you know, advantage, if you can actually make it work and make it beautiful, that's another way of making things really efficient. And then if we move on to the next one, you can then use more efficient file formats. So most people are familiar with JPEGs, and JPEGs are sort of generally considered to be more efficient than things like PNG files for photographs. But WebP is a web-specific file format that's far more efficient than JPEG, and it's supported by most web browsers. So, and there's a new one coming called AVIF. So if you're a tech company and you're looking at what you're doing over the next 12 to 18 months, look at AVIF format as well, which is about half the size again of WebP. So you can make images that look super high quality, high definition. You can make them you can make the files really, really, really tiny. So, you know, just as a WebP, you know, the final black and white one is 96% smaller than the original image I showed you, which effectively is a 96% reduction in data transfer and energy use. So that's amazing. If we move on from here, I mentioned if you don't use video, images are probably the biggest impact. If you do use video, video consumes huge amount of data and therefore energy and carbon emissions. So, I mean, the top tip for video is try to avoid autoplay. Autoplay means that the video is going to play in the background as soon as somebody loads that page or that app. And the thing about autoplay is it's not just bad for the environment, it burns through people's data. So there's a sort of social justice issue here that people with pay-as-you-go plans on low incomes, they load a page before they even know what's happening. You're just churning through their data. So giving them the ability to opt in is much better user experience. It's much fairer and it's better for the environment. And then just look at, you know, is video the best format? Can we make the videos shorter? Can we optimize the file format? So MPEG-4 is generally the most efficient video format for using on the internet. And video is often much more efficient than animated GIFs. So GIFs have kind of come back in fashion, and they're really like low quality, but really massive files. So it's kind of the worst of both worlds. So if you can use video instead, even if it still looks like a GIF, but you've just saved it as a MPEG-4, you have much smaller files. So that's something to do. If we move on to the next one. So fonts are something to think about. So most people sort of don't really think about the fonts that are used on a website, but there's two types of fonts and they have different impacts. System fonts are the ones that are already loaded onto your machine. So they're on your laptop, they're on your phone, and no data has to be downloaded in order to display that font. So it's things like Arial, Times New Roman, Roboto on Android phones. And they're not always the most beautiful, but they can be really functional, and they're basically free in terms of data. So hotels.com is a great example where they only use system fonts. And obviously they're a successful business and they've got away without using any custom fonts. And the good thing about that is that it also makes their website faster, which is probably why they've made that choice, because it's reducing the amount of data transfer. If we move on to the next one, if you are using custom fonts, then there's a lot of things you can do to optimize them. So I'm just going to use this example. InterUI is a really popular open source font, really beautiful. And it comes as a file format called TTF. As standard, it has 2,192 characters in the font file. It comes in 39 languages. There are 9 weights of the font. And you have to download each weight of the font as a different file. So each file is 300 kilobytes. If you had all 9 weights, it'd be 9 times 300 kilobytes, which is much bigger than an entire web page should be if you used all of them. So if we move to the next slide, I think on the next slide I've got an example. We can really cut this down just by thinking carefully about what we do and we don't include. So we can firstly reduce the number of variants. So you might only need 1 weight, don't use all 9. But then we can also do what's called subsetting of font. And we can also change the file format to a file format called WAF2, which is like the WebP of fonts. It's just much more efficient, smaller files. But subsetting fonts is basically where you strip out all the characters that you're never going to use. And there's websites that can automatically do this for you. So you put in the languages that you're going to use, like English, French, and it will just strip out all the other characters. So when we do this, if we just put in English on InterUI, we end up with 98 characters instead of 2,192, and a file format of 12 kilobytes instead of 298, which is incredible. And then when we convert that to WAF2 format, we get it from 12 kilobytes down to 7 kilobytes. So it's nearly a 98% reduction in file size. And yet to the end user, this font looks exactly the same. They will never know any difference. And it just shows it's digital waste. If you think of this unnecessary data as waste, and what we're trying to do is create a zero waste digital experience. And we can reduce it by 98% here. If we move on, so this tip, go easy on the icing. I'm talking about all the little extra things that you have on a website, like little animations and things that happen when you interact with something. And all of this stuff can be really beautiful in terms of user experience. And I'm not going to say don't do it, but what you can do is just like ask yourself the hard questions about, like, does this really make the user experience better? Is it really useful? And what's the energy impact? And is there a more efficient way? And the screenshot on the right is from the Safari browser. Safari browser has developer tools, and it's the only browser that has an energy impact tool, which is the dial in the middle of the screen of the image. And basically you can load a page and it will give you the energy impact. So what you can do is you can experiment by trying different like animation effects on a page and then run the energy impact tool to see how much energy that's using on the end user's computer. So when you hear the fans whirring on your laptop or your mobile phone is getting really, really hot, that's because it's got like super high energy impact. And what you want to be aiming for is like really beautiful effects that have a really low energy impact. So this is just something to experiment with and learn what works. If we move to the next one, Low energy colors. So this is more and more relevant as more and more devices move to OLED screens. So for sort of typical LCD screens that we had in the past, it didn't really make any difference. But OLED screens, which you get on nearly all smartphones now, a lot of TVs now, a lot of laptops now, they basically light up every individual pixel. It's like a tiny microscopic individual light bulb. So what that means is that a white page means that every light bulb is switched on to maximum brightness. And a black page means all the light bulbs are switched off, which saves energy. And then, every color in between is somewhere in between. The darker it is, the less energy it's using. And the only exception to that really is blue, which for some reason Google found that it uses about 25% more than red and green pixels. So white and blue color schemes, which ironically this slide is like very white and blue, are the most energy intensive. So just think about that. Obviously, you've got to follow your own brand guidelines, but there's a lot of things you can do in design to reduce the amount of white, reduce the amount of blue, and shift towards a darker palette. We move on. Tracking is a big issue. So particularly for media websites, the tracking scripts can be more in terms of both file size and processing energy than the rest of the website or web servers put together. And it slows down things, it invades people's privacy, it can ruin user experience. And I'm not saying don't track anything, I'm just saying use tracking really mindfully. Ask yourself, do we really need to track this? Is it the most efficient way of gathering the data that we need? Is it respecting people's privacy? And what you'll end up with is faster websites, less invasive privacy messages, and much reduced energy impact. So use tracking mindfully, definitely a big thing. If we move on to the next one, and this is sort of for a lot of projects, this is probably the lowest hanging fruit. I left it to last. Use green hosting. So switching hosting for a lot of projects is actually quite an easy job to do. The Green Web Foundation has a database of all of the IP addresses of hosting companies that have actually made a commitment to using green energy in their data centers. So you can run your own web address or any other web address through their tool and find out whether it's in a data center that's got a green energy commitment. Or you can also use their directory to find hosting providers that have made that commitment so that you can make an informed choice about who you're going with. And things to think about with hosting is location. So locate your servers close to your users so there's less data transfer. There's no point having your servers hosted in Dallas, Texas, if everybody who's using it is in the UK. It's much better to have it in the UK so you don't have to transfer all that data thousands of miles across the Atlantic. Efficiency, so there's lots of things that basically anything on the server that makes your website faster is probably going to save energy because it's reducing the amount of processing that has to be done. So there's lots of technical considerations there, but renewable energy is kind of the easy win. And the only challenge to that is if you're using something like AWS, Amazon Web Services, and you're hooked into their native tools, you're kind of locked in without rebuilding your servers. So if that is the case, then my recommendation would be to look at Amazon's commitment to renewable energy and find out which data centers they've actually started moving on to renewable energy supplies, and see if you can move on to that's relatively local, that's got a renewable energy supply. And that's a relatively easy win. And then the next one is my blatant plug for my book, which came out 2 weeks ago on sustainable web design and covers a lot of this stuff in a bit more detail, and also the more of the philosophy in the background. How do you actually get teams motivated about embedding sustainability into your projects, and what are the key things to think about when kind of looking to the future in terms of resiliency of the web, and how does it impact users and accessibility and kind of human factors as well. So that's available now as a printed or an ebook. And then finally, the Business Declares Digital Declutter Toolkit, which we've been working with Business Declares on for a little while now, and is really exciting. You can visit it online at the moment. We'll put the link in the chat. It's already online. It's not officially launched, so we're not sharing it too widely, but you guys can go and access the content. And it's really a starting point for companies to start thinking about their holistic digital impact, and how does that fit into their kind of broader sustainability mission. So looking at like an introduction to how IT hardware has an impact, video calls and streaming, which is obviously a big thing now, apps, emails, websites, cloud storage, digital marketing, giving an introduction to all of those key things that most businesses are doing on some level, but don't necessarily think about what the environmental impact of that is. So we're trying to give an introduction to that, suggest some key actions and some pointers to resources where you can go and find more. And this is really like an emerging field. Like unlike things like flights and train travel and energy, office energy use, digital emissions are very much something that hasn't been looked at much at all until the last few years. And so what we're hoping to do over time is flesh this out with more detailed information about how you can actually calculate the emissions. At the moment, there's a lot of unknowns, but it provides you with a really handy starting point and actions that you can take. So go and take a look at that, and hopefully you'll get inspired to dig into some of these areas and take action. Thanks, Sam, for sharing the link. And and that's the end of my second presentation. Feel free to contact me with the details on the screen. I'll put them in the chat as well.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Tom. Wow, there's a lot in there. I love the idea of the way that you talk about balancing the user journey versus the energy and the environmental impact, and the way that you make the point that actually you don't have to sacrifice the user journey. In fact, you can enhance the user journey.
Absolutely.
And therefore enhance the website without actually compromising success, I guess, and at the same time being good for the environment. I will never look at pictures on the web again after your presentation, particularly donkeys, so thank you for that. And I also love the way that you brought the kind of social element in as well by churning through data on that autoplay, something I've never even considered, but clearly you have, and I love that angle that you brought in there as well. So thank you for that. Just let me remind everyone, questions please in the chat.